Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Catherine Molho. She is an assistant professor of social psychology at VU Amsterdam. She is a psychologist studying human cooperation, morality, and the role of emotions in decision making. She draws upon insights from social and evolutionary psychology, behavioral economics, and evolutionary biology to better understand the factors underlying cooperative and punitive decisions. And those are the topics we're going to talk about today. So, Dr. Molho, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ricardo, for this introduction and for inviting me to the show. It's very nice to be here.
Great.
Thanks.
So let's start by talking about norms. So, from a sort of social psychology, I guess we could also say anthropology or anthropological perspective, what are norms? What characterizes them? I mean, if you go into a new society, if you do field work, how do you distinguish what is a norm from what is not a norm?
hmm Yeah, so I would say that norms are sort of informal rules, so rules that are not necessarily formalized or implemented by an authority or an institution. So the informal component is important. And then that what is important is also that they are shared. So people have kind of a shared expectation about what is appropriate, what is the right thing to do versus what is morally wrong. So yeah, in my thinking about this and also in the way that I have studied social norms in my research, I draw a lot about I draw a lot on the work of Christina Bicchieri, um, and this distinction between kind of empirical expectations, what we think most other people will do, right? Like how do they typically behave, and also normative expectations. So what is considered really appropriate and correct, and yeah, as far as normative expectations go, there is this additional potential for a behavior that goes against norms to be punished or to be sanctioned. And so in the studies that I've done in daily life, I focus more on violations of social norms, but then this is exactly how I describe these kinds of things to my participants as well. So it's something that goes against their own values, but also the shared expectations of their society about what is appropriate, and something that can be sanctioned or punished.
So, what would you say are the main social functions of norms? Is it for people to have expectations and also to know when to punish, when not to punish, how to establish relationships with other people? I mean, is that more or less it?
Yeah, so I think social norms can function sort of as a coordination devices. So having these shared expectations allows people, in cases where, say, there are not important conflicts of interest, to just choose a similar course of action and coordinate in specific way of behaving. In the case where there are conflicts of interest, yeah, norms can, I think, yeah, again, act as ways basically to guide people's behavior and to promote cooperative behavior when there is conflict.
And also perhaps to help decide who's wrong and who's right. I mean, to have sort of a guide to deal with conflict.
Yes, yes, exactly. So, yeah, if you think about contexts like the ones I study where you have third-party observers in order and they observe some kind of offense or a behavior that might consider right or wrong, norms can guide judgment to some extent.
And when do people consider that a particular norm has been violated?
Um, Yeah, so I wonder how to answer this question. I can answer it with based on the data that we have about like the kinds of norm violations that people report to us.
Okay.
Yeah, so what we have done in our studies is we've asked people in the Netherlands specifically, to report on violations of norms that they experienced on a day-to-day basis. And we did this in a kind of longitudinal way, where we asked them every day for 2 weeks if they experienced some offense, either against themselves or against another person. What we see is people often report violations of norms of politeness or cooperativeness, in the sense of, things that are rude behaviors, mean behaviors, or aggressive behaviors as norm violations. They also report many sexist or racist incidents as norm violations that they experience, and also things that are sometimes more closely related to the kinds of norms of cooperation that we consider in experimental studies. So violations that have to do with public goods provision, like someone littering, someone not contributing to a group project. These sorts of things are also present.
But how do norms arise? How is it that something becomes a norm? Is that something that you also study, or not so much?
Yeah, I would say not so much. So I would have to draw on others' work on this topic. What I'm currently interested in, and I can say a little bit more about, is a distinction between norms that are external versus norms that are more internalized. So yeah, I don't have data to share on this issue, but I think this is a very interesting contrast between say needing some kind of external enforcement and external pressure versus a norm that is more internalized, and so it has become part of a person's moral compass, moral values, and guides their behavior without external enforcement. So I think this is a key difference, and maybe this helps us also understand differences in prosociality, basically.
Yeah. So why do people punish norm violators?
Yeah, so this is a topic of much debate. I think in the literature there are many different accounts of what punishment is meant to achieve. I think there are at least two main ideas. So one would be that when people punish norm violations, they still are in some way acting in a way that is in their best interest, or the best interest of their kin, their allies, their friends. And another perspective is more that punishment has to do with promoting group cooperation, the welfare of the group, and norms at the group level. So the studies that I have done don't necessarily address this question directly, but I think I have some indirect evidence in support of this first account, so that people punish in a way that promotes their self-interest. So, for example, I find that, and this is, I think, a recurrent finding in the literature, that people punish offenses against themselves more harshly and in more confrontational, direct ways as compared to offenses targeting someone else. So we see much more, also in daily life context, much more second-party punishment compared to third-party punishment. Or we see, for example, that people punish offenders that are close relationship partners, people that they value more and in more confrontational ways. So I take that as evidence that, they are trying to change the behavior of people that they care about, basically. In a way that potentially fits their future interests.
Do people also punish people who fail to punish the norm offenders?
Yeah, so at least in our studies, I think we don't have many examples of this second order punishment, so punishing others who don't punish. But to be fair, we also didn't target these kinds of behavior. So we had specific prompts that had to do more with responses to offenders rather than punishers or non-punishers. But my interpretation of the literature and other studies is that it's not always the case that people consider punishers to be nice individuals, especially like nice or agreeable individuals. So I'm not sure that there are studies, for example, by Kimo Eriksson, Pontus Strimling, showing that people perceive punishers or perceive punishment as less appropriate than doing nothing, for example, under certain circumstances. So all of this to say that I don't think it's always the case that observers perceive punishment as the right thing to do against offenses. They might perceive it as aggressive or competitive, and they need sort of more information to be able to say if punishment is the right thing to do and if punishment is pro-socially motivated or not.
And do you have any idea why in certain cases people think that punishment is the right thing to do and in other cases not so much?
Yeah, so I think, and in that, yeah, I guess I am quite influenced by Nicola Raihani's work. I think that, yeah, there are certain, say, conditions under which, as an observer, I might infer that punishment is pro-socially motivated. And if I make this inference, I take punishment as a sign that the person is trying to promote a cooperative norm or something like this, then I will think it is the right thing to do, potentially. But if in contrast, I make an inference that this is a competitively or aggressively motivated behavior, punishment, I might not like the punisher as much. So, yeah, just to mention this briefly, we do have some data. I do have some data that looks at basically what kinds of personality traits correlate with punishment behavior. So I look at two ideas. One is that it is pro-social individuals who will engage in more punishment, following kind of this argument that punishment is meant to promote prosociality and cooperative norms. And the other one is that aggressive traits correlate more with punishment. And I find consistent evidence for the second one. So aggressive individuals are more motivated to punish. So there must be some additional conditions, in my opinion, some institution that makes punishment serve cooperative goals or something like this, for punishment to be perceived positively and as a signal of cooperativeness.
When it comes to these personality traits, do they have anything to do with a particular inventory like the Big Five or something like that?
Yes, yes. So I have used in my research the hexacle personality inventory because, yeah, it really differentiates between these components of agreeableness, which is more about niceness and lack of anger, and honesty, humility. So I look at these traits, and I also look at trait aggression with a specific inventory developed to study this trait, and social value orientation, which is meant to capture kind of people's pro-social motivations towards others.
So could you tell us about direct and indirect punishment?
Yes, so I've used this distinction a lot in my work so far, and originally I used or I read about this distinction more in the literature that has to do with aggression. So the distinction has to do with how basically confrontational and overt versus less confrontational and less costly the tactics that we use are. And so direct punishment I consider as being high cost responses to offenses that are confrontational, so they might involve physical aggression or a verbal confrontation that is either aggressive or it can also be more constructive, but basically puts the person who intervenes in a position that they are face to face with the offender. And then there is a risk that they might receive counter punishment or retaliation. Whereas indirect punishment I consider as tactics that are more low cost and covert, so indirect. So for example, things like gossiping or engaging in social exclusion. And the idea there is that these indirect tactics don't expose the punisher, the person who intervenes, as much, and so they might reduce certain risks involved in punishing offenders.
So you mentioned gossip there. What functions does gossip serve apart from perhaps being a tool for indirect punishment?
Yeah, so exactly. I think traditionally gossip has been seen as a tool of indirect aggression, indirect punishment. I think more recently, in the last decades, it has been proposed that gossip has kind of one of its key functions is to support indirect reciprocity systems or partner choice, and in that way support cooperation. So then the idea is that gossip is a key way to exchange reputational information about others in your social network or in your group. And this reputational information is key to figure out who you should cooperate with and who you should choose as a partner or avoid as a partner.
Right. So I think that tied to all of these, we have the moral emotions, and there's a debate, I mean, among people who study these kinds of emotions. The debate is basically about if it's possible really to distinguish between different pairs of emotions, I guess, and if they are really distinct or not. So, for example, in your work, I read about disgust and anger. Is it possible
Yes.
to really distinguish between these two?
Yeah, so I think that disgust and anger generally, like these systems, are quite distinguishable. If we're talking about pathogen disgust and anger, so disgust originally is really, in my view, an adaptation to deal with threats that have to do with pathogens in your environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed, the idea is that disgust has kind of different domains that it applies to, and one of these domains is morality. So we do observe that people report experiencing disgust as well as anger in response to moral violations of all sorts that have to do also with harm, care, injustice. So we see people using disgust language. But you are right that distinguishing moral disgust from anger is much more difficult than distinguishing pathogen disgust from anger. So people often do report experiencing a mixture of these emotions. Experiences of moral disgust and anger they can be correlated. So it is definitely more tricky to distinguish them, especially I think at the physiological level. In the work that we have done, we really look at a distinction in terms of their consequences. So how moral disgust and how anger relate with different behavioral tendencies. And there we found across many, many studies, also replicated by other labs, that indeed we see unique associations between anger, disgust, and different behaviors. So we see that anger is specifically associated with kind of direct confrontational responses, and disgust is associated more with these more indirect responses like gossip and ostracism.
So in this case, when it comes to disgust, particularly, you distinguish between pathogen disgust, sexual disgust, and moral disgust. I'm asking you about that because there are people that think that there's not really a third category of moral disgust, right?
Yeah. I mean, I do. So, yeah, this model that you're referring to is work also by Josh Tybor on this distinction between three domains.
Yeah.
Yes, so I do follow that kind of framework in my work. And also, I do observe, like in the data, that people consistently report experiencing disgust in response to moral offenses that have no pathogen content and no kind of sexual content. So they do report disgust in response to moral violations specifically. Yeah, and I also see that observers who see others experience disgust interpret it in a similar way. So they interpret this as having to do with some kind of moral sentiment and expect them to behave in specific ways.
But when it comes, because this is what we're talking about, when it comes to the distinction between disgust, particularly moral disgust, and anger, are there
Mhm.
specific contexts or cues that elicit these specific emotions?
Yes, so I think there's been a substantial amount of work trying to link anger and moral disgust to different content of moral violations.
Okay.
And my interpretation actually is that of the findings is that that is not necessarily the case. So it's not necessarily the case that unique content of moral violations elicits different emotions. So also in our studies, we see that the same kinds of violations that have to do with harm, that have to do with injustice, they elicit both anger and moral disgust. In terms of the input or like the kinds of contexts that elicit these emotions, where we see differences is in the self-relevance of the norm violations. So we see that when people experience a violation that is more strongly targeting themselves, they report feeling more anger. But when they observe a norm violation targeting someone else, they experience more moral disgust. And so, in our view, this is functional in some way. The experience of moral disgust is then accompanied by, gossip, ostracism, and responses that maybe don't put the individual in so much risk, but they aim to recruit punishment from others and coordinate punishment with others when an offense has not been personally relevant.
So it doesn't seem to have anything to do with the content of the norm that is being violated.
I mean, this is definitely a point of ongoing debate. But
Okay.
speaking based on my data, I observe that the same kinds of violations elicit both kinds of emotions. But then, who is targeted, and what are the specific costs of the violation for the self might affect emotional responses.
Yeah, because it just came to my mind that it would make sense. I mean, you can tell me if it makes sense or not, but that perhaps norms that have to do, so let's think about, for example, moral foundations theory and the moral foundation of sanctity, purity, that is usually associated with things related to religion, for example, and the moral emotion of disgust. So, I mean, would it make sense that if a norm that is related to sanctity, purity, if it was to be violated, it would elicit moral disgust? And, for example, if it was a norm related to, I don't know, care, harm, fairness, it would elicit anger. I mean, do you think that could make sense?
I think so. I think so. I am just not sure to what extent, the data that we have, and not just in my studies, but more broadly in the literature, that
No.
they support such a clear-cut distinction, especially when we're talking about harm violations. So it
No.
seems that violations that have to do with harm elicit all sorts of negative moral emotions.
No.
Um, with purity and sanctity violations, I do think that disgust might play a key role as the predominant response there. Um, but we really need to study this in situations, so with violations that don't have pathogen or sexual content. So often these violations that are related to purity or sanctity are also related to, they contain pathogen cues or cues to some kind of sexual misconduct or something like this. And so the disgust we observe as a response might not be moral disgust per se. So I think it is key there to use the kinds of cues and stimuli that can differentiate between these possibilities.
Would there be individual differences here? Because it seems that different people have different levels of disgust sensitivity, right?
Yes, we do. We do observe that there are indeed individual differences in disgust sensitivity across also these domains of pathogen, sexual, and moral disgust.
No.
And there are also, for example, sex differences in disgust sensitivity that are quite well documented. So yes, indeed, that is the case, I think.
So, is there, of course, as we've been talking about, disgust manifests in many different areas. So, one of them, or do you think, is there evidence that there's a link between disgust sensitivity and, for example, opposition to immigration?
Yeah, so I think there are indeed many, mostly correlational studies that
Okay.
have looked at this relationship and find indeed that, say, people who are more disgust sensitive also have more conservative attitudes, and among those attitudes, they have more negative attitudes towards outgroups and towards immigrants. So I think a lot of the evidence in that regard is correlational. We have tried together with Annika Karinen and others to conduct an experimental study to try to test this idea that disgust sensitivity relates with negative attitudes towards outgroups, and testing different accounts for why this might be the case.
So, but would it have anything to do with, for example, contact avoidance or something else?
Yes, exactly. So in that study that we did with Annika, we test two different accounts of why disgust sensitivity might relate with negative attitudes towards immigrants. One is exactly contact avoidance. So one idea in this literature is that individuals who are more disgust sensitive avoid people from different countries or different ecologies. So people who are immigrants, because they might pose a stronger pathogen risk. And this is because they come from a different ecology, potentially with carrying pathogens that one is not immune to, one is not able to face based on the immunity they have developed in the local ecology. So according to this perspective, we would see a stronger relationship between disgust sensitivity and negative attitudes towards immigrants when there is contact. The more contact I have with them, the more I would feel scared about this pathogen risk. We propose, and we're not the ones that propose it, but we test an alternative to this, which is that the relationship has to do more with traditional norms and abidance to norms that have to do with, say, food preparation or hygiene, etc. So a separate reason why disgust might relate with negative attitudes to outgroups is because we think that they have very different norms about hygiene-related or pathogen-related things. And so long as they don't adapt with the local norms, we want to keep them away, something like this. So we test these alternative accounts in an experiment. Basically we manipulate the extent that people can expect to have contact with an immigrant in a hypothetical scenario, and also the extent to which this person assimilates to norms or not. And we find basically support for the traditional norms idea. So we see that disgust sensitivity is associated with more negative attitudes towards immigrants who don't assimilate to local norms, when they don't assimilate to local norms. When they do assimilate, this relationship is much, much weaker. But we don't see that contact matters as much.
Do you know if parasite stress theory would also apply here?
Yes, so parasite stress theory, I guess would suggest that, yes, I am not sure about the predictions it would make for this particular context. I need to think about this. I suppose it would suggest that, at least at a first level, the higher the parasite stress, the higher the pathogen prevalence, the more discuss sensitivity, and potentially the stricter the norms that have to do with dealing with pathogens.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess it would predict that more pathogen stress would be associated with more traditionalism and more conservative attitudes. Yeah, in that sense, there is a study conducted by, I don't know if you are aware of this, by Josh Steiber and colleagues across different countries, where they look exactly at the relationship between parasite stress and discuss sensitivity and different kinds of facets of conservatism. And they find that parasite stress and discuss sensitivity is specifically associated with traditionalism. So this tendency to abide to norms that have to do with pathogen avoidance, but also other traditional norms. And it has less to do with, it is less associated with social dominance orientation. So really this kind of competitive, conservative attitudes that consider certain groups to be more dominant over others.
Yeah, I asked you about that because it could be another ecological factor in this case influencing people's disgust sensitivity that then would have implications in terms of their views toward norms, norm violation, political orientation, etc. So, I mean, basically in this case, a pathogen load. So.
Yeah, so I do see how pathogen prevalence will influence discuss sensitivity and the strictness of local norms when it comes to yeah, pathogen-related behaviors. But I think that so long as one would perceive that immigrants or yeah, incoming populations adapt to these strict local norms, we shouldn't observe or we should see a dampening of these negative attitudes. At least this is what our findings suggest.
Okay. So, changing topics now, when there's hierarchy and power asymmetries in human societies, how is cooperation achieved and maintained?
Yeah, so this is also it's a tricky question. I think there have been different propositions in the literature about this. So I come more from a social psychology background, as you mentioned at the beginning, and there has been a lot of work really looking at the say corruptive effects of power. So giving people more power in a situation and creating hierarchical differences makes those in power less cooperative, more selfish, etc. So according to this kind of view, introducing power differences might have negative effects for cooperation. But at the same time, there are alternative propositions suggesting that hierarchies and hierarchical institutions help us coordinate and in that way, I mean, facilitate kind of achieving common goals in a society. In my own research, what I've tried to do is to really look at how this could potentially happen. And to study this, I've looked at how people with different kinds of power positions, how they use, again, different tactics of punishment in order to promote cooperation. The idea there being that when you are in a high power position, you might feel entitled, but also feel like it is possible for you to engage in direct types of punishment, costly types of punishment, without expecting much retaliation because of your position and because of the power you have. Whereas if you're in a low power position, you might opt for different kinds of tactics. And this is really building on this idea of a reverse dominance hierarchy, right? So that people who are in a, say, subordinate or low power position in a society or in an organization or wherever, are not going to necessarily confront violations by a high power individual, not alone in any case, but they're going to use things like gossiping with others in order to coordinate punishment and then kind of form a coalition to promote cooperation. So these were the ideas that I set out to test in some experiments, and also in the study that I mentioned earlier in this daily life setting. In the experiments that I've done, I didn't really find support for this idea that people use different strategies to promote cooperation depending on their power. Yeah, this could be because of different reasons. One is that the particular context that I studied didn't involve much conflict of interest. It was a situation that was relatively benign. It was relatively easy for people to establish cooperation there. In the daily life studies that we've conducted, we do find evidence that high power individuals punish more confrontationally, and individuals who feel they have low power use more gossip, ostracism, more indirect ways of intervening.
But so it's not necessarily the case that more societies that are more hierarchical have more difficulty promoting cooperation.
Yeah, so I think I guess the short answer is no, but also this is not something that I have tested directly. But my interpretation is that, say, different societies might come up with different solutions to cooperation problems.
Yeah.
So, and the scale might matter. So when we move from small scale to larger scale societies, hierarchies might be one kind of way to deal with coordination or cooperation problems. But this is also just one kind of institutional solution. But we do see this tendency that as the scale of cooperation problems increases, institutions become key, and hierarchy can be an institution that facilitates coordination in these contexts.
So one last topic. What is interdependence and how does it relate to cooperation in people's daily lives?
Yeah, so this is a topic that I did a lot of work on during my PhD, and this concept of interdependence has a long history, also in social psychology. Starting with Kelly and Thibault in like the 60s, 70s, and up to today. It has to do with really like the structure of social situations, social interactions. So really how the choices that people have in a social interaction, how they affect their own and others' outcomes. It's really just, I think, a way to understand the games that people are playing with others in their day-to-day lives, and this is also how we approach this in our studies. So we look at when thinking about interdependence, two things, like the objective interdependence of the situation. So really what is the structure? How do people's choices affect outcomes? But we also look at the subjective interdependence. So as an interactant with you, say in this interview, how do I perceive that my choices affect our outcomes? And this could be different from the objective reality. So what we did in the work that you mentioned is we again used a methodology where we asked people about the social situations they experience on a day-to-day basis. And then we ask them about how they perceive the social situations they face in terms of different dimensions of interdependence. So we focus on three key dimensions based on this theoretical framework that are mutual dependence. So basically, how much our behaviors influence each other. Conflict of interest, so whether we can achieve an outcome that is good for both of us, or whether our interests are conflicting, and also power asymmetries. So who has more power to influence the other's outcomes in the interaction? And we see how these affect cooperative behaviors in these daily life contexts. So what we find is conflict in particular is very important. So the more conflict of interests people perceive, the less they cooperate themselves and the less they see their partners cooperating. And returning to power, because you mentioned it before, we don't find that power has a direct influence on cooperation in daily life, but we find that if you are in conflict of interest situations, then power makes things worse. So within conflicts, having high power negatively affects cooperative behaviors.
That is, the person who has more power cooperates less? Is that it?
Exactly. Yes, yes. In the presence of conflict. Exactly.
So, I mean, of course, this is still, you're still studying this, but how does it compare to other approaches to cooperation, particularly in social psychology? Do you think that interdependence is a better framework to understanding human cooperation than other frameworks out there?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say it is better. I would say definitely that it is complementary to many other frameworks. What I
Okay.
think is nice with interdependence theory is that it's, at least in my mind and based on the research that I have done, it really allows for links across different disciplines. And it allows hopefully to reach a common language when social psychologists are discussing with economists or with evolutionary biologists. I say this because interdependence theory to a large extent was based on game theory, and it has an emphasis on the objective situation, and so in a sense like the games that people play. And so it can create a link between the ways social psychologists view cooperation problems with the ways, say, behavioral economists view cooperation problems, or evolutionary biologists view cooperation problems. And also there's been some work trying really to study more fitness interdependence. So linking this concept of interdependence with other concepts from evolutionary biology. So I think it is a theory that allows for these links, hopefully.
Okay, so just before we go, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
So people can find my work on my website, and they should be able to find all my papers there. It's Catherine Molho on GitHub, so if you look for that, you can find them. And I'm also on Twitter as at Catherine Molho, and people can always feel free to reach me via email, etc., that they can find on these pages.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, and again, I really enjoyed it, and I very much enjoy your interviews in general. So thanks. Yeah.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alec, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolfkin, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, and Max Belby. My producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.